Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today is the second day of Earth, Energy, and Environment E3 Conference and Exhibition, second year 2022. My name is Jomana Tariq. Abdur Razak. I'm a petroleum engineer, a recent master's degree in petroleum engineering graduate from University of Houston, currently working as an engineer in Houston, Texas. I have the pleasure to be here with you this afternoon as a member of the technical committee of Earth, Energy, and Environment E3 Conference and Exhibition. Today, we're pleased to welcome our invited speakers, one of which is Professor Ben Ebenhack. After a bachelor's and a master's, both in petroleum engineering, Professor Ebenhack worked as a petroleum engineer in the industry for over a decade. He then moved to academia and worked as a senior lecturer for over 23 years. Then he became the chairman of the board at Ahead Energy. He's the recipient of the McConnell Award for the Service of Mankind jointly from the American Institute of Mining and Society of Petroleum Engineers in the year 2010. He is now a professor and an industry partners chair of the Department of Petroleum Engineering at Marietta College, and today he will be discussing energy's role in sustainable development. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, Petro, where you can also find all of our previous and upcoming sessions in Earth, Energy, and Environment Student Conference and Exhibition. Again, that's our YouTube channel, Petro. Please feel free to send your questions in the chat box, and we will answer as many questions as possible. With that, I ask you to give your full attention to Professor Ebenhack. Hi, Professor Ebenhack. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad to have you on Earth, Energy, and Environment Student Conference and Exhibition.
Thank you very much, Jomana. And if I see questions showing up in chat box, I will make a point of ending a little bit earlier because I think discussion is really the most interesting thing that we can do. The topic of energy's role in sustainable development has been very dear to my heart for many years. I've written a number of books related to that. I've worked in development issues, and I think it's going to be one of the defining challenges for the younger generation. What is it we want in general? We want to meet survival needs. We want development, progress, economic opportunities. We want abundant and available resources and environmental integrity. All of these are factors in sustainable development. In order to think about sustainable development, we really need to think in global systems. A good deal of the work of Donella Meadows, I think, has been instrumental to challenging us to think in systems. We can argue about details of her analyses, but I think the notion of systems thinking is essential. One of the things I like to point out is that for 400 years in science, we have been very successful at dissecting problems into ever smaller components. Now, the challenges of sustainable development require that we start reassembling to look at the whole picture, putting the pieces back together again. This image is one that my frequent co-author Daniel Martinez made. I'll be referencing work that he and I did together a number of times in today's talk. He's trying to show the linkages between critical resource systems, which we lumped together as food, water, and energy in the service of people. And the arrows are showing dynamic interactions and feedback loops between those critical resource systems, all of which can be considered to be a part of the environment. I think it's worth stepping back to define sustainability. It's a term that came from sustainable development, which was defined in the Brundtland Commission report to the World Commission on Environment and Development back in 1987 as that which meets the needs of people currently without sacrificing opportunities for future generations. I think that this became popularized because it is a very compelling ideal. And I think that one of the reasons I want to come back to this definition is that sustainability and sustainable development have been so popularized that in some ways they've lost the roots. And in particular, I think a fair amount of talk about sustainability leaves out the critical part of meeting the needs of people, both currently and in the future. Meeting the needs of people, I think, is a quality of life issue, or human development is how the United Nations commonly defines this. And to measure that, the UN has developed a metric referring to aggregate qualities of life of a population. The factors that go into that in the Human Development Index that the UN defined would be GDP as a common measure of economic activity and robust economy. Life expectancy at birth is also a common factor. The UN's Human Development Index tries to merge several of these. Some authors also look to happiness, and I don't think any of us are opposed to happiness. I think the challenge for us engineers is that it's such a fuzzy concept that we may have trouble getting our minds around it. But I have seen some interesting work on even attempts to quantify happiness at a population level. The UN's Human Development Index is the one that my co-author Daniel Martinez and I chose as what we consider to be one of the more robust, combining several of the factors I mentioned on the previous slide: life expectancy, literacy, school enrollment, and GDP. Literacy and school enrollment, of course, have quite a bit of overlap. When Daniel and I were seeking to evaluate the role of energy in promoting quality of life, we plotted the UN's Human Development Index on the y-axis versus per capita energy consumption by nation on the x-axis. The original plot that we did, similar to what a number of authors have done, showed a correlation, but it was a little fuzzy. But one of the things that we recognized was that there were actually two trends overlaid on one another. One trend for energy export dependent economies and a different trend for the rest of the world. So we did a filter to separate those two trends, and for the moment set aside the energy export dependent economies to look at the rest of the world, and got this striking trend. It's a definitive relationship within a reasonably small margin of error. If you gave me a per capita energy consumption, I could tell you what Human Development Index equates to it. And we, having identified this, divided the trend into three sectors. At the top, the energy advantage trend, wealthy nations that have adequate energy to meet all their needs. A transition zone of growing economies that are fairly successful, and energy poverty, using the least amount of, or having the least amount of energy available. One of the striking things I think that's important is the saturation phenomenon. that we witness that beyond the transition zone, more energy really doesn't equate to increased quality of life. The paper in which we first revealed this did get a number of citations, and a fair number of authors commented that there is clear correlation, there is not clear causation, and I would agree. And I would, in fact, say that neither Daniel nor I believe that Human Development Index results purely from energy access. But we would argue that we believe both logically and quantitatively there is good reason to believe that energy is a necessary, although not sufficient, factor to promote development. The other critique that we really noticed was that the saturation phenomenon, where it levels off in the energy advantage section, could be an artifact of the way that the UN defines the Human Development Index as an index going from 0 to 1, that it would be impossible for it to exceed 1. And we're doing some work currently on trying to denormalize it and see if we still see this trend. I think we're going to be still seeing the trend. In fact, a student a few years ago did a very interesting research paper where he made the first effort at denormalizing. And I think that's going to be very interesting. Baseline energy needs beyond about 2,500 kilograms of oil equivalent per person per year reaches that saturation threshold. One of the other things that I'm doing as we update data is going to a more normal indicator of energy use. The data we found that was most complete used this funny kilograms of oil equivalent per person per year, kilowatt hours or BTUs. Some multiple BTUs would be more normal for people. About a little less than half of that, about 1,000 kilograms of oil equivalent per person per year, marks the threshold from what we would characterize as energy poverty into the energy transition zone, where more energy equates to better quality of life, but begins to approach that leveling or saturation point. The type of energy, we would argue, matters as well. The difference between modern energy, and I will talk a little bit more than most authors would about fuel wood or raw biomass dependence. So we plotted fraction of biomass dependence on the x-axis with HDI on the y-axis. Got a trend, a negative trend, as you would expect. The more you depend on firewood, charcoal, and dung, the less quality of life, but not as clear a trend as we saw before. At the time that we did this, Mozambique had the lowest quality of life index, Human Development Index, and I've done a fair amount of work with colleagues in Mozambique, so that was very interesting to me. Had an HDI at the time of 0.354, and one of the factors I use to help people picture that is that the average life expectancy for a male in Mozambique at the time was 44 years. So if I were the average Mozambican man, I would have been dead for 24 years, which I view as not a good thing. And Mozambique, as well as having a low per capita energy access, it was 85% biomass. And contrary to what a lot of, especially Westerners, would imagine, that includes a tremendous amount of dependence in urban areas. Honduras still uses a fairly small amount of energy per capita, but has less than half the biomass dependence. We'll talk more about why I would argue that the shift, that one of the most urgent transitions in energy is away from biomass dependence. More than half the world, about 3.5 billion people, currently depend primarily on biomass fuels. The absolute numbers are likely to increase, even though the fraction has been going down with development efforts. Another factor that is not commonly known outside of development communities is that the World Health Organization has estimated that pollution from cooking over open wood fires causes 4 million premature deaths per year. That's 4 times what they estimate for malaria. It's actually comparable to the rate of fatalities during World War II. So it's an enormous health crisis. If you read up on this, you can find quite a range in estimates of these fatalities. I have, in this case, chosen one of the higher end estimates from WHO. Looking at energy systems more broadly, and the fatalities attributed to each, cooking with firewood accounts for 76% of the fatalities globally from energy use. Driving, automotive transportation, is by far the next largest source of fatalities at 24%. All others round off to 0. But if we expand on that nominally 0 fraction of the pie, we find that of that very small fraction, coal, and particularly coal mining and transportation of coal, accounts for 92% of that. Then oil and gas, the sector that many of us represent, is 4% of that almost 0, and equivalent to large-scale hydropower. The human safety factor, I think, doesn't get enough attention in planning for sustainability. Firewood dependence is responsible for the most fatalities by a very large margin. Driving, which is a consumption pattern unrelated to the source, is the next greatest hazard. Amongst modern energy sources, coal is by far the most hazardous. Limits are one of the other things that people talk about quite a bit, especially during times when oil prices are rising. Concerns about running out of oil become prevalent. At the time that I was starting much of this writing, around 2000 and early 2000s, there was a conviction amongst many that global petroleum production would be in permanent decline by the year 2005. And I found it interesting that some of those authors still insisted that it was in permanent decline up to 2010, even though global oil production had risen by about 10% from 2005 to 2010. There's little discussion in most popular media about limits to renewable resources in terms of the raw materials required, the manufacturing that's required, or one of the other essential resources, time, and the time it requires to scale up manufacturing and production of these alternative energy systems. This graph is clearly out of date. I did this again back when there was a lot of argument about reaching a peak in 2005, trying to demonstrate that that was not likely and that a sharp decline was even less likely. So it was really prepared before the shale plays changed our understanding of how much oil we might ultimately get. The light blue line, though, I think is still worth paying a little bit of attention to, because it shows that even if we were to take an extremely optimistic view of how much oil and gas there were in the world, we would still be looking at a peak occurring within the next 100 years. The peak that I showed in the purple line was still using 3 times the ultimate resource, recoverable resource, that many authors used. So the impetus for transitions in energy systems come from resource limits, from environmental impacts, and from human development needs. The resource limits, again, gets a lot of talk when oil prices are high. So I predict that you'll start seeing a fair number of authors talking about the peak is here, the peak is here. Once again, environmental impact, I haven't talked much. I haven't talked really at all today about climate change and other aspects of environmental impact. Certainly biomass that I've referred to has enormous environmental impact as well. It is a major factor in deforestation in many parts of the world. And then meeting the human development needs. What resources will provide for the quality of life that we seek? Limiting factors to transitions. Cost has clearly been a limiting factor. One of the things I like to point out is that the success in producing vast quantities of fossil fuels has set the cost bar very low, that any resource that, in order to compete in the open marketplace, must be able to provide large amounts of energy at very low cost in order to be able to compete openly with the fossil fuels. Related to that is that many transitions will require new infrastructure. The hydrogen economy that is becoming popular to talk about again is going to require a tremendous amount of new infrastructure. Manufacturing and raw material inputs. I'll be showing a slide in just a few minutes about how much manufacturing will be required for solar photovoltaic to become a significant player in global energy mix. And then the resource time. How fast can things happen on the one hand, and when do things start to deplete on the other? So time is a limiting factor in both senses. This diagram, I would encourage you not to try to commit any of it to memory. This is a preliminary attempt that, again, my colleague Daniel and I made, borrowing the character of it from authors Feldman and Wurst in their piece on optimal pricing through value modeling. We tried to use their structure and put in energy related values and costs. But I think certainly it's worth noting that resource viability is essential, which can include running a depletion, that some resources will deplete and become unviable or less viable over time. I also want to throw in here, nuclear fusion is one of those that currently, in spite of the vast potential, it is not technically viable as a resource. I'm sorry, that really belongs in the third box, technological viability. Economic viability. Ultimately, everything has to be able to compete. Social acceptance does matter. Nuclear fission is one of the resources that could grow dramatically and pretty rapidly, and has virtually zero carbon footprint compared to other sources. A number of authors even put it lower than solar in its carbon footprint. And yet fear limits its availability to grow. So at some point, energy systems have to be able to address all of these factors, and we'll be looking at an optimization problem. This slide just kind of for fun, really. I developed this years ago, comparing the transition to petroleum when petroleum really was developed as competition to whale oil. Whale oil was beginning to deplete, and it was getting harder and harder to murder as many whales as we needed. And kerosene was found to be fairly readily distilled from crude oil. 1 year after Drake's famous discovery well, the petroleum production in the United States totally dwarfed the peak of whale oil production ever. Contrarily, as of 2005, when I did this graph, total renewable energy production in the US was still dwarfed by petroleum. And yet, back into the 1970s, we were really trying to talk about a transition to renewable energy. So the last transition where petroleum became dominant was one of limit to abundance. Now we're going from something that is very abundant, producing in very large quantities, and systems that are trying to produce much less are trying to compete with that. Therefore, in my second last book, I did the calculation. If solar photovoltaics were to reach 20% of global energy demand in 20 years, what would be required? At the time, 15 terawatts of global energy was being consumed. To reach 20% of that would require manufacturing 10.4 million 200-watt solar panels a day. A 200-watt solar panel is about the size of a desktop. The top of a desk, not a desktop computer. This slide runs through the basic calculations that I did to come up with 10.4 million 200-watt solar panels a day. Several times larger manufacturing than was available then or is available now. And by the way, I did update these numbers this past year, and some of you may be thinking, well, solar has really grown dramatically. But from such a small level that it has not kept pace with growth in energy demand. So today, if we rerun the same calculations. Now it would take 11.3 million panels a day in order to reach this 20% goal in 20 years. It is physically possible, but I think it highlights the demand on time and resources. Here, I did a graph compare. Wind actually, even though it doesn't get talked about quite as much, had been growing much faster than solar up until the last few years. And I did a plot extrapolating the exponential growth in wind production and compared it to oil production, black line, and I even reduced oil production by a value related to the cost of carbon credits at the time. So this purple, this lighter purple line is showing the reduced value based on the externalities of climate change. The darker purple value is showing that demand will want to increase, partly because of that half of humanity that doesn't have access to modern energy yet. In our book on valuing energy, my co-author Daniel and I did a rudimentary stab at trying to compare the values of energy systems. And this is a summary of our findings in that. Absolutely arguable. We did a very rudimentary scoring of basically -3 to +3 on each of these factors of abundance, safety, social acceptance, economic value, and environmental impact, and then aggregated that. I think that it's certainly arguable, and some years ago I got to see Herman Daly, famous economist, give a talk about externalities. A student rose from the audience at the end of Herman's talk and said, well, what you don't understand is how complicated it would be to value all these externalities. And I'm sure he'd heard this challenge before. I loved his response. Dr. Daly said, I don't care what value you apply, just don't make it zero. And that's the same sort of thinking that Daniel and I applied. Sure, there's lots of room to argue about each of these values, but if you look at the aggregate, raw biomass has, based on our rough estimate, a net aggregate value of -6, compared to gas of +4, solar +4, but bear in mind that that's hypothetical. It's comparing solar as it produces to gas as it produces. The current abundance is much smaller than that. One of the takeaways I'd like people to have is how destructive fuel wood dependence is. There's time cost for gathering, hazards in gathering the firewood. In many regions, women and children go out into the forests to gather firewood from semi-rural areas, and rape and murder is common, a common hazard that they face. Forest loss, and I hypothesize that forest loss is worse than it looks on satellite imagery, because I believe there's probably species preference. So there's brushy undergrowth that firewood marketers will go right past in order to harvest the more desirable species. Demands on household income. Firewood in some places It costs considerably more than we pay for gasoline in the US. The respiratory disease that I've mentioned and limited development potential. So the conclusions I'd like to offer up, there is a correlation between energy use and quality of life. I believe we can demonstrate that it is at least a partially causal correlation. Raw biomass dependence is, I believe, the most unsustainable of current energy systems. Increased access to modern energy then is essential for eliminating poverty. Exchanging energy for cash does not guarantee maximum increase in quality of life. That is exporting. Energy transitions present an optimization problem, needing consideration of a large array of factors. So I'd like to stop there so that people have some time to ask questions. And I think I need to change my view in order to see. Okay.
This was a very interesting discussion. We are going to have multiple questions, but I want to add a comment first. Dr. Farouk Ali and Dr. Farouk Ali is a professor at UH, who wrote a paper about several months ago, and we presented in an annual meeting. And it is exactly about some of the things that you talked about, basically time to scale up. And the paper is available from SPE, and we have a spreadsheet that we'd be glad to give it to people, that spreadsheet to do all that calculations. We make it available to others. But we have multiple questions here. Let me see. The first one, you addressed a little bit, is can hydrogen and or fusion-based power generation become the main source of carbon-free energy in the future?
Yeah, that interesting and fairly popular question, because people like to talk about them. Fusion is something of the brass ring that if we were to be able to develop technology and economy for controlled fusion, the resource base is incredibly vast, and it has the potential to be very clean. Thus far, we have not been able to achieve a sustained net energy gain from a controlled fusion reaction. The head of the laser lab for energetics at the University of Rochester, who built his career on one approach to controlled fusion, a few years ago made the remark that people always ask him when we'll have controlled fusion at a commercial scale. And he said his answer would be 40 years. But he added, if he had been asked the question 40 years ago, that's the same answer he would have given, which I think tells us that fundamentally, even this person whose career is fusion is saying the progress towards achieving that is minimal. And I'm convinced that we're still at the point where we need scientific breakthroughs to make it work. And those are totally unpredictable. Hydrogen is possible, but it's not a source. It is a carrier. And so we need to figure what is the primary source that generates hydrogen, as well as solving all the engineering problems of storage and so on. See, are there some
right in this? There's another question here: which home heating systems based on green energy technologies should be developed in view of the current developing energy crisis?
Well, I think ground loop geothermal heat pump is one of the best home heating systems. It is pretty expensive to retrofit. I've looked at it for my own home. and would love to have it, but it would be an investment in the environment. It would not be an investment for my economic welfare. In new construction, I believe we're going to see a lot more of this technology. Otherwise, I think in the United States, in most of the United States, natural gas is readily available and inexpensive, and one of the most efficient home heating systems. And clean. Natural gas, we need to be clear, is the cleanest burning combustion fuel, naturally occurring combustion fuel there is.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. We have 2-3 more questions. Let us capture them and we'll answer them separately. How about that?
Okay.
Professor Ebenhack, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. It is, I like it because we are doing similar things in the University of Houston. Thank you.
I'm going to look up yours and Farouk's paper for sure.
We'll send you the paper and the spreadsheet.
Great. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all.